Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I'm the Vice President of the Interreligious Council of Linn County. On this morning's show, we're going to have a discussion about white privilege. And I have with us this morning three guests that are going to help us talk through what I would consider to be a fairly controversial and sometimes confusing subject. So, but before we do that, I'd like for each one of you just to take a quick minute and introduce yourself. What do you do? And why does this particular topic interest you?
All righty. Well, good morning. I'm Joy Briscoe, and I am currently the Diversity Program Recruiter with Cedar Rapids Community School District. This topic interests me because it just relates directly to the work that I do. In this capacity, I help make sure that we have diverse representation in our teaching student body, or for our teachers and for our administrators as well. All children experience a more vigorous learning environment when they have teachers of color, but currently in many schools across America, people aren't getting that opportunity. And so understanding that we have to create access to pathways for students of color to become teachers of color is critical to the work that I do and critical for the growth of our students in our districts.
Excellent. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you.
I'm Maurice Davis, Empower Program Manager. I run a local entrepreneurship program that's really designed to support minorities and low SES or socioeconomic status individuals start and grow their businesses. I would say I'm passionate about this subject for multiple reasons, but primarily because I deal with entrepreneurs that a lot of times are faced with barriers that come from many different facets and sometimes stems from race.
All right. Thank you, Maurice.
My name is Colleen, and I'm a teacher and social activist. I've been working with anti-racism workshops and social activism for many years. The topic of white privilege is important to me because I think I need to be conscious and aware of how my privilege impacts so many other people and affects those around me. And I want to educate more white people to understand what it is and how it affects those around them.
All right, excellent. So let's jump right into it. So leading up to this show, of course, as I do with most of my episodes, is I always like to have just a little micro conversations with people about the topic, just to see what people's reaction is, and just kind of the man on the street type thing. And it seems that with the topic of white privilege, I've run across kind of three distinct reactions. It's either one, confusion, right? Sometimes conflated with white supremacy or something like that, or just confusion about what the term actually means. The second one is really, yes, it's a serious problem in our society that we have to address head on. And then the final response is that of really pushing back against this notion that white privilege even exists, and as far as to say that it's really just something that's kind of manufactured, if you will, to kind of stoke racial tensions. Mm-hmm. And so that's been kind of the reaction I've had, and so I thought it would be very interesting to kind of talk through it here, and just to help people educate themselves on it, kind of draw their own conclusions. Obviously, each one of you have a very unique perspective on it. But I wanted to just kind of start with how you would define white privilege, and maybe even an example of how you've experienced that in your life. And maybe we'll start here with Joy.
Alrighty. I agree what you said. Those are the three very common responses to white privilege. And actually, in my experience, I've run in more of two. Now, a lot of my skill or friends that I'm close to, they are aware and they're conscientious that white privilege exists. But kind of sometimes when we go outside of our bubble, it's either it's something that you're still talking about, and why are we still talking about race, or real confusion on what actually that is. And a lot of times when people hear white privilege, they hear, you don't feel like I earned the things that I worked for. You don't feel like I've worked hard for my success. And that is not what white privilege is. White privilege is saying that, yes, you might have worked hard, but your skin color has not been a barrier for you. Your skin color did not deny you access. And so sometimes when you're able to break that down, then people start to understand and they start to see it as, I'm not saying this is anything you did, but I'm also saying because your ancestors, that doesn't cause you barriers into moving up the ladder towards success. That's typically where I have people want to give pushback on white privilege. It's about access and not having barriers for me.
Interesting. Maurice, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I would say, to kind of build on what Joy is saying, when I think about how do I define white privilege, it's the ability to live your life without your skin color taking a consideration on your actions, your dress, the way you speak, and the way you act. A lot of my white friends, when I tell them that I have to be very considerate of where and when I wear my hoodie, and that's never something that they've ever considered, and trying to explain even that and what it means to be a young man of color walking down the street in a hoodie in a dark neighborhood, and how that can create unconscious thoughts and connotations about what I may or may not be doing. I would say the absence of that feeling or that thought is white privilege.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I definitely would agree, because I, as a white person, can go around and I don't have to think about those kind of things. I don't have to think about what am I wearing, because of the color of my skin. I get an unearned privilege, which is what white privilege is. It's unearned. It's benefits that you get because you're born into this skin. I'm born into this skin, and I have certain things that I can do because I am white. And it's all about my recognition of that and how to step back and say, okay, I'm not the authority here. I need to listen to other people. I need to understand where they're coming from and their different situations are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up in this town, Cedar Rapids, and we don't have a large non-white population, let's say, in Cedar Rapids. And so I grew up with, as a young middle-class white kid, around other young middle-class white kids. And but I was also involved in a ministry where we went into some of the poorer neighborhoods in Cedar Rapids, and which were predominantly white, but also had black, non-white kids as well. And it was interesting, growing up, I saw I didn't perceive it as privilege, right? I perceived my privilege as maybe economic, because I was comparing myself maybe to just poorer kids, and then I would go home and see, wow, I have a lot. But I guess I never really considered, how me being white gave me that kind of economic privilege. And I think for a lot of people that's the case, right? And I think it's interesting then for us to kind of, for white people, to say, to kind of step back and say, okay, what is it about, my privilege that I do have as a white person, and what advantages has it given me, and in what way can I then help to empower other people that maybe don't have this same privilege? And for me, it's, and I think for a lot of people, this whole idea of white privilege has kind of come into the public consciousness, right, in the last maybe 6 years ago, dating back to what appears to be kind of the Black Lives Matter movement. But do you feel as if there is a kind of an awakening or a greater self-awareness of white privilege amongst white people, or do you feel like it is still a major problem?
I would say that not as much as I would like to see. I still live in a predominantly white community. There are no people of color. And just to add on that a little bit, Alan, is instead of saying non-white, the term white being the norm or the standard, people of color or people with pigmented skin or something like that, to me feels better because I'm not the standard here, and it's not up to people of color to educate me on what my white privilege is. It's up to myself, and to educate myself and to read and to try to get a better understanding of how my privilege affects people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'll be quite honest with you, this has certainly been one of the most daring shows for me to have, because to be quite honest with you, I feel like I am, that I probably don't have enough awareness around it that I should have, right? And there's natural biases that I'm up against, things of that nature. And so, I feel like it is, I want to do this thing right, and I want to be able to learn, and I want to be able to kind of have this experience with everybody, right? And so I appreciate that, Joy. I mean, that's Colleen, sorry.
That's okay.
And so, anyways, but do you feel like there is maybe, to Colleen's point, what is the responsibility of white people when it comes to educating themselves on white privilege versus that of a person of color? So these are some tough questions.
That's a great question.
So I'd say that the challenge is acknowledging what you don't know, and that's hard when you're in a position, especially in a place where like you said, you grew up in a neighborhood that was predominantly white, and most people that you interacted with were white. It's difficult to acknowledge a privilege when that's kind of the level playing field. I think sometimes, while I would agree holistically with the fact that it's not really the responsibility of someone of color to say, hey, you know what, hey, check your privilege or whatever it is that you want to say, but it is an opportunity for people of color to say, hey, this is something that I deal with. Have you ever thought about how this impacts me on a grand scale of this consideration that you may not have? So I'd say yes and no. I think it's an opportunity, but it's not a responsibility.
That's a great way. And awareness is, to build off what they both said, awareness is the first step. And once you have awareness, there are going to be things that you can say to your peers and you can say to your peers that we can't say to your peers and it be received. I'll give you an example. Some of the groups that I belong to, where we talk about economic opportunity and things of that nature, we often do pick an ally when it's a message that we really want to be received, because we have examples of times where maybe I said something or someone else of color in the group said something and it wasn't received, but if we then have a white male come in and say it, then it's like, well, that's the best thing ever, and it could have been something that 2 weeks ago somebody else said. And so understanding that in your privilege, you kind of, once you are aware of that and you kind of have a responsibility to say, look, let's address our privilege. Let's learn more about it. It's not something that you learn one day and you're completely done. For all of us, it's an ongoing journey, and that's okay. So you got to know that. The important piece is that you take the journey and you walk on those steps and you progress and you make process towards being more aware about what privilege is and how you can check your biases.
So I mean, how much does empathy just kind of play into this, right? Like you empathize with people of color, right? That they have potentially some distinct disadvantages that you may not have. I mean, how, and maybe what does that look like when it comes to empathy? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but what are some things that I can do? I'm talking about like me personally to try to. I mean, obviously we're having the show, we're discussing it, we're trying to help educate people on it and come to their own conclusions, but I mean, what are some other things we can do to kind of, again, help to, I would say, probably decrease white privilege and to help kind of level out the playing field? I mean, obviously, that's, again, another difficult question, but is there anything you can kind of hone in on with that?
That's a great question.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, okay. I'm not sure that you can decrease white privilege. It's because it's so ingrained, it's so there, that I'm not sure it can be decreased. But I think the awareness around it, like Joy was saying earlier, I think the awareness around it and just recognizing it is, because I used to be in a place where I didn't know that I was privileged. I didn't know that I had this invisible benefit that I get just because my skin is not pigmented.
Well, I think you actually bring up an interesting point. Or maybe I did, I don't know, but this idea of decreasing white privilege, right? Or making it, I don't have as much privilege. I mean, historically, if you look back, I guess I would argue that certainly people of color had it worse off maybe than they do today, in some really empirical terms, right? And with the absence of slavery, maybe historically here in the United States, and other forms, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, segregation, so on and so forth. So it seems as if, and certainly feel free to disagree, that there has been progress made when it comes to the very, very privileged status that white people did have in this country at one time. So I guess then my question becomes, is that the case? Do you agree with that? And do you feel as if that we can continue kind of that trend down to where people of color don't have artificial barriers, Joy, that you had so eloquently said here at the beginning? I mean, do you feel like we can make progress and, for lack of a better term, decrease white privilege?
Oh, you're asking to unpack a lot.
Yeah.
And so
Well, we have plenty of time.
Yeah, ton of time.
There we go.
I don't know about decreasing white privilege as a whole, but I think when you talk about what's the impact is really what we're kind of getting at here. And we talk about diversity and inclusion, and that's really the vehicle. And when I think about it, especially when you talk about employment, let's specifically there, because it's a really easy one where you can look and say, are you diverse or not, and how that impacts a group financially. Well, we as a organism enjoy being around things that are familiar. And so when we go out and find people to fill roles, and when we go out and find people to lead us, we tend to lean toward people that look and act like us. And that's not a bad thing. That's just a natural tendency of comfort. And so when you think about like how do we dissipate the power that it has, it's being intentional about when there is a C-suite executive role. Well, we have to step outside of what we're used to find people to fill those roles. Not saying that they, what am I looking for right now? When you think about this idea of going to the extreme and saying, well, we're going to fill this role just because they are of color, that's not what we're talking about here. We're saying being intentional, and if you have a applicant pool of 10 people, let's fill 5 of those with some qualified individuals that don't necessarily look like what your C-suites already look like. And that helps to change the overall power that it has. It changes the environment, which changes the way you think about things.
One of my mentors always says, diversity is a choice. So if you don't choose to want to be inclusive, you won't be it. And sometimes people think that it's a natural thing that happens. But as Maurice just said, naturally we're inclined to hire people or to want to be around people that we are familiar with. So that throws that totally out the window, that naturally diversity is just going to happen.
That's a great point. I mean, making diversity in the workplace or any other place for that matter a high priority certainly pushes back against our natural tendency to not operate and live and work in diverse environments. So I think that's extremely important and an excellent point, right, of being able to again assimilate all races together, and so that we do have hopefully again a level playing field, right? This idea to where, the Martin Luther King Jr., right? So we won't be judged by the color of our skin, but the content of our character, right? Really kind of arriving, if that ever exists, into kind of this post-racial culture, right? In which we can just truly interact as humans without necessarily judging people by their skin. But again, we're up against tens of thousands of years of civilization and kind of hard-coded in our DNA to prefer people that look like us and act like us over others. So I'm certainly up against a lot. And as I mentioned, there's I've had conversations with people that are very animated that this idea, this concept of white privilege actually kind of has serves really only to kind of I mentioned at the beginning, kind of manufactured and really just serves to kind of stir up racial tensions when they don't actually exist, right? One of the descriptions of white privilege is, it was actually this author, Peggy McIntosh, in her book White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondence through work in women's studies. Anyway, she talks a lot about it, and she uses the term white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets, right? And I can see what people looking at that and saying, well, what is that? That seems extremely abstract, and is this something we're just, making up to kind of create divide when it really truly isn't there? Do you feel like there's even a grain of truth to that, meaning that too much emphasis on this idea of white privilege actually does serve to kind of stir the pot when it doesn't need stirred?
I don't feel that way.
I don't feel
I
that
think
way
that
either.
for a while there was this notion of to be aware meant that you were to be colorblind. So I don't see color.
Yeah,
How
exactly.
often did we hear that?
Right.
But I am a black woman. You are a
Exactly.
white woman. That is innately who I am. So when you say that, you're not seeing
I'm not
me,
seeing you.
right?
Exactly.
And so if you don't see me for who I am, then we're not being inclusive about all of joy. And so what that also does is there are some experiences and things that come with this skin, with this person, with this short hair and the brightest jacket I could find and be on TV today,
love
that you want to be a part of your team, And so we don't want to cancel out these parts of people that have so much assets to the overall team experience. It's important that we see that. And so because we are now having to counter that narrative of color blindness, we just want to see people for who
Right.
they are, and I don't see color. Well, that's not true. There's beauty in the differences that we all have. And so
Yes.
we need to acknowledge those and see those. So for me, myself, I don't feel like we've put enough emphasis on that white privilege does
Yes.
exist, and that we do need to address it, and that there are some unique barriers that come from being a person of color.
Yes.
So you agree that we don't actually put enough emphasis on
That's
it?
what I feel.
Yeah,
And
I
would
would
Maurice
agree.
and Colleen agree with that?
I agree.
I would say I'm not disagreeing. I would say I'm gonna do a shout out to my mother here. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. And
Yes.
so when we're delivering this message, I've been in rooms where white people are like, oh, I feel bad for my privilege, and it's like, well, I don't want you to feel bad. I don't want you to feel guilty. Like, this isn't a thing you did or I did. It's just an acknowledgement, and it's a conversation. Conversations where folks are apologizing as they're talking about something that they're doing because they want to make sure they're not offending me, and it's like, that's not what any of this is about. Me as Maurice Davis, I work really hard in order to be knowledgeable and successful, and me acknowledging that white privilege is a thing, I also acknowledge that means, all things being equal, if it's me and someone that's white, I have to work harder in order to be in a position where I can overcome that additional barrier. And it's all about acknowledgement. It's not necessarily that anyone can do anything independent of yourself.
So to kind of segue into one of the questions that I had, which you touched on, which is this idea that as a person of color, you do have to work harder.
Absolutely.
To achieve maybe the same success that somebody given the same resources that is a white person would have to do. So do you feel in some sense that again, going back to my previous question, and again, kind of playing the role of devil's advocate here, that it could throw cold water on the dreams and ambitions of a person of color, saying, hey, listen, I know you want to achieve these things, but just so you've got a lot of barriers to overcome, and it's unfair because of again, biases, the unconscious biases, et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel like there is, or do you feel like no, it actually helps to motivate people more? And I don't mean to, I know I'm kind of directing this at you. Feel free to anybody jump in here on this.
I'll say, again, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And so I don't have any kids, but if I were to be talking to my son, the conversation I would have is, young man, there's something that you have to acknowledge, that if you want to get here, that means you have to work 10 times harder than what you think you have to. It's not an excuse not to be successful. It's an acknowledgement of the quantity and quality of effort that it takes to get where you want to be. And so that's really, again, saying you want something, put in the work and go get it, but you can't do what the person standing next to you is doing. You have to do more, and you have to do it better, and you have to work harder.
And in most African American households, that is a conversation you have. I have 3 children, and one of which is 22, but no one tell anybody. She's my little sister now. But and from the time she was very, very small, I talked to them about, you're going to college, but to get to college, we didn't come from a wealthy background where I can't write a check and do that.
Right.
So what your grades need to look like, what your academic involvement needs to look like, to get to the level that you want to go to and that we're aspiring for, you're going to have to work that much harder. So that's very much a conversation that oftentimes is had, that not as necessarily, it is a barrier, but it does set a playing field for that you're going to have to work harder. You have to achieve more. You're going to have to sacrifice more to get to where you need to go. And so she did. She graduated with a 4.7 GPA.
Fantastic.
She was the 2nd highest in the district. But, I mean, again, we were up many a night sacrificing, thank you, working very, very hard to get her to that point. So.
Yes. And I think that as a white person, my education of my child would be these are your privileges. You have this here, so, but other people don't. And I want you to recognize that exists, and that there are some privileges here. So if you're watching a television show, why are there no people of color on this show? If there is, why are there no books out there for little kids that have black and brown people in them? Why is it that they're not seeing their faces, people of color, they're not seeing black and brown faces in children's books, or in or on TV, or in movies? And why that's a conversation that I have with my daughter to help her understand her privilege as a white child.
No, I do think it's absolutely invaluable, right, for communities that maybe struggle with certain things, whether it be economic challenges, family challenges, et cetera, to have role models, for a lack of a better term, or just figures that show them that you can succeed, and that we do live in a world in which, although there are artificial barriers and other things that you'll be up against, you can achieve great things if you put your mind to it. And being able to show people that, whether it be through TV, sports, books, whatever the case may be, I think is very, very, very valuable. So again, thank you for this conversation this morning. It could go on for some time, but it's been very educational for me, and I appreciate it very, very much. So I hope you also were informed and educated as well, and we appreciate you tuning in. Hope you have a great Sunday. Take care now. Bye-bye.